So, Christine, thank you for joining this conversation with our Wonder Labs Living with Fire Design Challenge teams. I cannot wait to get us started. But first, I want to quickly just share some context for why we're meeting to talk about entry points and partnerships for effective and actionable social science research, which is what we agreed on in terms of the title for this talk. Well, there is a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that this is what we've all been engaged in through the design challenge in this past year. And so I thought it would be useful to meet and talk about our experiences with the research. But there is a long answer. And I think it might be more interesting for Christine, but also for all the new faces who are joining in today. So I am Shefali Lakina, co-founder of Wonder Labs, a social enterprise based in San Jose, California. And we are focused on catalyzing innovations with communities on the front lines of climate impacts, with a current focus on wildfires. Now, in the context of this work, in 2021, we created the Reimagining 2025 Living with Fire Design Challenge. And with that, my aim was really to center the voices and the experiences of students and early career researchers in ongoing conversations about wildfire risk management. I felt that there was a general lack of engagement with young people's visions for how we can shape priorities in what we know is going to be a fiery future. And so I wanted to encourage more students from diverse backgrounds to engage in social science research with community partners and to facilitate this kind of collective visioning around what a reimagined future of living and working with fire could, or perhaps should, look like. And so the design challenge has really been about advancing a method of co-learning and co-creating research with communities who are on the front lines of wildfire impacts, while also acknowledging that student researchers often live and work in these communities and call them home. Now, the pathways that each team has identified to engage with communities, again, however broadly communities have been defined by each of your teams, the entry points and the partnerships have varied. And that's always an interesting thing to reflect on and learn from, which is why we're gathering here today. Now, I know that in the current cohort, each team is at a slightly different stage of the research process. I know the Colorado team, I hope they will join us today, has engaged. Hi, Kari. Oh, great. You're on mute now. The Colorado team has completed their research and the community partner is now engaged in the implementation phase. I hope that Maya will join us shortly to talk a bit about that in the discussion session. The FFRP team from the Bay Area team, which is Kari, who just joined us, I know is in the process of completing their last interviews and beginning their coding and their analysis and their writing up phase. And then the FireGen Collaborative, who are also on the call today, are in the process, I know, of launching into their research interviews. And you may have already done a few focus group discussions, but we'll hear more about that soon. And so I thought it would be useful to have this discussion so you could all learn from each other. And who better to frame and kick off this discussion than my former PhD advisor, good friend, and now colleague at the Fire Journal, Dr. Christine Eriksen. Christine is a wealth of knowledge in all things fire and social science, and I know you will enjoy hearing from her today. I've already shared Christine's short bio in the meeting invitation, but I will soon put it in the chat as well. And I encourage you all to look at her website, where you can learn from all her excellent writing and teaching materials over the years. So Christine, we cannot wait to hear about your experiences with conducting effective and actionable social science research and hear any advice that you may have for our design challenge teams. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Shefali, and thank you so much for taking the time, everyone, to speak with me today. I'm really excited. And let me just share my slides. Can you see those now? Great. So when Shefali invited me to share learnings based on my experience for the past almost 2 decades now, which feels incredible when you think back, but really has been an organic career that has kind of gone from one continent to another, but also always with fire at the center of it. And as I started to think about what I was going to share with you today, I realized that entry points and partnerships in my career as a fire social scientist really is a case study of me, which sounds odd, but I don't want this to become a navel-gazing exercise, but I'd rather like to emphasize the importance of understanding positionality, values, and unique skill sets. So it's a little bit along the lines of a career talk, but it's not. It's a case study. So let's see how I go. The reason why I want to take this approach is because I really think the positionality, values, and unique skill sets is what makes us as researchers. And so some of us might focus on really similar issues or the same case study areas, but in really different ways and from completely different angles because of our own positionality and our own values and our own unique skill sets. And so really this is about my journey of how I figured out these particular values and skill sets and positionality for me. And in the course of going through some of those learnings, I'm going to share 7 key lessons that I figured out along the way, which I think are really significant. So lesson number 1, know who you are, not just on paper, but at heart. And so at heart, I am a disaster geographer. And really, I learned that because of my empirical research, not from textbooks, but empirical research taught me that disasters are social phenomena. And so more often than not, what makes people vulnerable is exposure to socially constructed risks. And this was not something people really spoke about when I started my career. And so it was something I really learned on the job and sometimes the hard way. But what I also figured out with time is that what really kind of drives my curiosity as a researcher is local environmental knowledge and the societal coping capacity that's generated by it. And I also understood that what makes me happiest and therefore also what makes my research the best is when I'm out getting my boots dirty in the areas where people live and work. And that also gave me the insight that what I'm really good at is listening. And I've kind of known that for a long time. But what I realized when I was doing my research was that I don't just listen, I tend to hear what's not said. And that is one of my unique capacities as a researcher. And you learn that when you're doing your research. So that's really insightful. But also what I learned is I really like doing my interviews alone, something to do with the trust building that you generate. But the insights I gain from my empirical research is greatly enhanced through collaboration with other researchers and practitioners, because these collaborations is really what truly enables me to go deeper and kind of open up these novel conversations about social and environmental justice, which is at the heart of my research. And so although I today often takes these kind of insights for granted, because it now underpins everything I do as an academic, it was the process of learning that disasters are social phenomena that really taught me who I am at heart as a researcher. And this in part I learned because of the work I did with trauma-impacted people who then traumatized me, which then meant that I needed to seek help. And in the process of seeking help to deal with this trauma, I learned what I really value, but also how I'm variously impacted by and a product of the social and structural inequities that shape our society. And so that's been part of my journey too. Lesson 2, connect the pieces to see the bigger picture. Like today, I know that I provide leadership. I lead through sustained research and ethical knowledge exchange. But it's taken me a while to get there and to understand how I do that. So while I understand myself and my unique abilities as a disaster geographer today, my academic identity has, of course, been a work in progress ever since I embarked on my education and career as a geographer in the late 1990s. And so in the next few slides, I'm going to share some examples to demonstrate the entry points and partnerships. And please take notes as you go along, because it will be quite superficial what I share, but I'm very happy to talk in more depth afterwards. Because what I figured out as I started to reflect on my research kind of in the last 5 or so years is that really with time, my research has turned into kind of a sustained and multifaceted research program that broadly speaking spans the 5 interconnected research themes that you see on this slide. And what you might notice when you see these 5 themes is that fire isn't mentioned, even though fire is like everywhere in my research. My case studies is about fire, but really it's so much more than that. I think that's a really important thing to understand in understanding the impact and the effectiveness of your fire research more broadly. So many of the individual pieces that now make up the sustained whole, of course, were not always planned or conscious efforts to achieve an end goal, but influenced by really random opportunities or the lack of opportunities that can force us to change tack. And it's also really important to emphasize the temporal element of research impact, because while the results from your research and my research might seemingly seem effective and actionable from the moment you deliver them, it can take time, sometimes years, before others are either ready to listen or ready to learn, let alone ready to implement the actionable points from your research. And the reasons can be really diverse. It can be something as simple as a lack of resources, but it can also be much more insidious in the form of power privileges that make people want to keep the status quo, regardless of how broken or outdated that status is. And so they are all points to reflect on as well. An example there would be my first book, which was published in 2013, which was Gender and Wildfires, which went out and then disappeared into a great big hole. And it took about 5 years before I was really started to invited to give keynotes on the topic, because the community just wasn't ready. I was ready because I'd just spent 7 years researching it, but the community at large was not. Lesson 3 is about finding the golden thread. And so my golden thread in my research is everyday lives and lived consequences. So while many of my case studies have focused on wildfires, if not 99% of my research has done so, the real connecting factor between my many projects and publications are the qualitative methods, the decolonial approaches, and the strong collaborations that underpin all of my work. And what has kind of driven that has been that I've always tried to give voice to everyday lives and lived consequences of environmental history, whether that's near history or the far distant history. And really, the narratives that research participants have shared with me has shaped my outputs, and that is what has made my research decolonial, because of how these voices has enabled me to see the impact of what I was studying. And so this is also why my research has moved seemingly fluidly from a focus on local environmental knowledge and fire as a land management tool in African countries to the trade-offs between risk and benefits in the context of demographic and climatic changes in Australia, to a focus on social and particularly gendered dimensions of disasters internationally. Lesson 4, start, acquire, and sustain it by empowering others. So I choose to champion social and environmental justice through critical feminist approaches. And this really is an example of how I learned the hard way that the trick to continuing to champion justice through critical feminist research is to build, acquire, so when you need to catch a breath, others will hold the tune. And that's really important when you do research. So in the past decade or so, I have really consciously developed my research profile and leadership skills to empower others and collaboratively address social and environmental justice matters that I am passionate about, but that is also the passion of the people I work with. And so despite the historical and structural injustices that are so deeply embedded in most academic institutions where we do most of our research, my work has made me really acutely aware that I, as an academic, have a privilege and a power to choose. And I had a power to choose when I was a student. I have a power to choose now that I'm a more senior academic. And the choices I make really matter. And that can be choices such as research topics, classroom exercises, curriculum, reading lists, and the focus of my outputs and statements more broadly. But it could also, and is very much so, a choice of who I choose to mentor or supervise or collaborate with. And so these choices are a tool for championing social and environmental justice in my toolkit. And it's also an approach that continuously challenged me to learn and self-reflect on who I am as a researcher. And that makes me more honest and a better researcher. And that's ranged from gender inclusion and of sexual and gender minority groups in academic policy and management domains. I've worked with Indigenous communities to revive ecocultural fire knowledge. I've worked with kind of efforts and workshops to promote researcher trauma and making research ethics and methods trauma informed by working with human research ethics committees, so the IOB boards in the US system. An example of that would also be Shefali's PhD research, because it's worth mentioning here that when I advertised that PhD position, Shefali applied, but the project she applied for was a very different project than what Shefali actually ended up doing. But that's because she brought a lot of initiative and a lot of capacity to that position. And what she also does was an incredible capacity to connect people, so former refugees, refugee resettlement services, the City Council, the New South Wales State Emergency Services, and by bringing them all together to have a conversation, her research was incredibly impactful, not just for the State Emergency Services, who created this multicultural liaison unit for the first time in New South Wales, but also for the participants in the research from the conversations they had and how that then enabled them to be part of this official new unit that had a much broader community impact. And so that's really an example of how Shefali took an opportunity that I was able to provide a platform for and then make something really efficient out of it. And I think these are the opportunities that we keep needing to look for, but really also Shefali was part of the choir that I was trying to establish to keep the tune going when I was running out of steam and voice. Lesson 5 is make stakeholder engagement sustained, honest, and accessible. And this is, of course, easier said than done. There's a lot of talk about how researchers are in academic ivory towers and that the language is wrong and the connections are not honest and true. And I think that's actually not right for a lot of researchers. It's just a very time-consuming endeavor because it requires you to keep at it for long after your research might have finished. So one of the things I do is I lobby for change by explaining the unnaturalness of disasters. And I do this again and again and again in different ways to different people again and again and again. And so really that has enabled me to have an ongoing conversation with emergency services and environmental management agencies to assist their efforts to adapt to climate exacerbated hazards. And I've done that in different countries around the world. I do it in part when I start out on my research, but I do it continuously by speaking with, presenting to, and writing for really diverse audiences. And I keep the conversation going on and off the record constantly. So, and a conversation I often have, which is a really frank conversation, particularly when you're talking to emergency services, because the conversation is that fancy equipment and technological innovation will never be enough to make communities resilient or prepared for fire if those local communities are not equipped with the knowledge for informed decision-making when disaster strikes. And that's kind of a key point, because as academics, we are not necessarily practitioners. Most of us are not. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of stakeholders or partners don't understand when they partner with researchers, is that they think not only are we going to do the research, we're going to provide all the solutions. And that is not necessarily, most of the time, that's not what we do. What we do is we provide insight that can then support informed decision-making that the stakeholders and partners can use to change their policies and actions to make them more effective, whether that's engaging with communities or a particular way of approaching fire suppression, whatever it might be. And one example for me, for my research more recently in Switzerland, has been the way that I've had an ongoing conversation with the Swiss federal parliament about the need for them to upscale their capacity to respond to climate exacerbated hazards. And so I started the conversation by focusing on what I know most about, which is fire. And so when I first moved to Switzerland in 2020, I wrote a policy perspective where I reflected on these catastrophic fires we just had in Australia and California at the time, and how the writing was on the wall for Europe too. Like, this was not going to go away. This is coming our way in Europe, and how we needed to rethink wildfire policy because of it. I then did some extra work with some of my colleagues where we looked at very concrete examples of what climate change would do to climate exacerbated hazards in the Swiss Alps, to make it more tangible for the people we were trying to convince that they needed to adapt. But what we also did was we were commissioned by the Swiss Federal Office for Civil Protection to provide an evaluation of whether Switzerland should join the European Union civil protection mechanism. And we talked to any Swiss person about joining or being part of anything that's to do with the European Union. They all break into a cold sweat. They are staunchly anti-EU here. And so having this conversation is really difficult. But what we did with our report and the research that went into the report is we had conversation via interviews, not just with a diverse range of stakeholders in Switzerland, but with stakeholders from within the EU civil protection mechanism in Brussels. We had interviews with different stakeholders in different EU member states, particularly Norway, because Switzerland compares itself to Norway in all sorts of ways, because Norway is also not part of the EU, but they are part of the civil protection mechanism. And so we really brought so much evidence together that the report was so solid that even though we point out both risks and benefits, by the end of it, all the naysayers had a really difficult job convincing anyone that Switzerland should not join the EU civil protection mechanism because of the way that disasters just know no borders. we published our report in 2021. And then we kept the conversation going behind the scenes with stakeholders, at conferences, at other meetings that were about completely other things. We kept talking about what are the obstacles to making this happen, what are the benefits of making it happen, what will happen if we don't do it. And as we were having this conversation, Europe was literally burning all around us, right? So fire was doing the work for us too, in many ways, and flooding was doing the work for us, because France, Germany, Austria, Italy, they were all impacted, and Switzerland looks to its neighbors to see how they should adapt. And so what Switzerland initially did was they very quickly then commissioned a review that they did internally of their own capacities, particularly in the context of wildfires. And that showed that there was all sorts of things they needed to improve. And it was a real kind of, well, great, we've already achieved something with our work. But then last week, so we're now talking almost 3 years later, it was announced that there'd been a vote in federal parliament that Switzerland will be joining the EU Civil Protection Mechanism. And the opening sentence of the press release was the opening sentence of our report. So this is like one of those things where it's 2 years since we finished the report, and it's 2 years of conversations with no track record because it's all been off the record. But our aim with this, of course, much has happened that we haven't been part of, but we know that we've had a really significant influence on this process. And I think that for me is a real clear example of the effort that's required on and off the record to make research effective and actionable. Lesson 6, I don't really want to labor this point, but I just wanted to add it in because it is very important in all sorts of ways. And that is that research is effective and actionable in the classroom. And this is something that we often forget, particularly if we are keen researchers and not keen teachers. But really, teaching is a way to reach a really diverse audience. So it's another way for me to enhance coping capacity, because using a research teaching nexus as a tool for knowledge exchange is a way that I reach a really different audience that my research otherwise would reach. And so when possible, I make my teaching about my research, because not only am I excited about my research, but this excitement comes across when I present it in the classroom, and that's contagious. And so students often become more involved because they follow on from the excitement of my presentations of the topics. And we'll get back to it in the next slide as well. But really, it's about also seeing teaching as an opportunity for you to become a better researcher, because in conveying an effective lesson, I need to ask myself, what did I learn from doing this research, and how did I learn it? What was the methods and theories I used, and how did I communicate it along the way? And how am I going to communicate it to the students in a way where they can get something out of it? And so in creating clarity for my students, I often enhance my own learning experience in the process. Lesson 7, which is the last lesson, is treasure feedback. It is like holding up a mirror. And so what feedback does for me, it gives me access to the subconscious, both my own subconscious, but also that of others. And I've included a few different examples here from students, from book reviewers, and from stakeholders that I've worked with as part of my research. And I want to focus on first on the middle example from one of the students, who says that they really love the passion behind my teaching. You can really tell that I'm experienced in the field. But then they also go on to say, quote, "It feels like she's promoting an agenda rather than a neutral platform to learn from." Now, I read that and I laughed, because of course I have an agenda. I want to decolonize the curriculum. I want to have inclusive voices in my classroom. But the one thing that I didn't achieve, so I achieved as much as the student can see that I have an agenda, But what they didn't get from it is that the university is not a neutral platform. And I feel like if only I knew who the student is, I would contact them and say, do you not realize that a university system is built on the agendas of white patriarchal European men and have done for centuries, meaning that many of the inequities we have, not just in the university system, but in society at large, are continually perpetuated within the system. And so this, for me, is a really important lesson in the research teaching kind of outreach I do, is that I need to explain to students that it's not just me that has an agenda. We all have an agenda, not least the establishing fathers of the university system. Quickly, an example from the manager of the Melbourne Metropolitan Fire Service. He says that what he really got out of the research is that partnerships outside the sectors could sway corporate change within in the sector. And that's, of course, a win-win situation. I get lessons from the partnership, but they also take lessons away that they can use. So that's a clear example of how it's been impactful. And then the last example there is by Professor Maureen Reid, very esteemed feminist geographer from Canada, who, when she reviewed my first book, pointed out that I do not avoid subjects that are considered taboo. This is true. It's very confrontational in many ways because I put it all on the table, all the layers that make our society vulnerable or resilient in various ways. And this can, in her words, feel like a brutal honesty. And that's true. It can be really brutal when you see what we are doing right, but also what we're doing wrong and how those two play across each other. And so the chapter in my book that particularly got to Maureen was an interview I do with a firefighter from CAL FIRE, who after 40-year career chose to retire when his small community was burnt out by a fire, because he was so frustrated with the historical legacy of the wrongs that he felt was continually being done in the way that prescribed fires was and was not being used. And it was a very emotional interview, and it was very confronting in so many ways because of the honesty in it. And so really praise and criticism are amazing in terms of feedback, because this kind of at times subconscious feedback really influences with our behavior and our belief systems, knowingly or unknowingly. And so I think it's really good to constantly have that mirror held up to you in various ways. So to summarize, and I think I've just summarized very briefly here, because I think really these 7 lessons about doing effective and actionable research lead to entry points and partnerships. It's all kind of cyclical. But also, once you learn who you are, not just on paper, but at heart, once you really understand your positionality, your values, and your unique skill set, once you're able to connect the pieces to see the bigger picture, once you know what the golden thread is in the projects that you're working on, so not fire, but what are the underlying golden threads? Once you are able to start a choir and sustain it by empowering others, once you can make stakeholder engagement sustained, honest, and accessible, once you are able to use the insights you learn from your project as teaching material, and once you start to treasure feedback, both the good and the bad, what you're really able to do is to answer 3 really critical questions. And of course, one of the entry points into a lot of my research has been that I have been very successful for many years in writing research grants. And that has given me the capacity to not just enable others, but also to go off and disappear into various places and get my boots dirty and really learn from people. And you need to be able to answer these 3 questions, not just to convince others that they should either take a stake in your research or work with you, but also to convince funding bodies that they should fund your work. And it's simple questions, but they're hard to answer shortly and succinctly. And that is, why this research project? Why this research project now? And why this research project by me or us, depending on who it's by. And once you can answer those questions, interestingly, most people find it hard to answer just the first one, why this research project, in a way where they're sitting across on over a cup of coffee and sharing with a friend. It's really hard to do, but once you can do it, effective and actionable research kind of follows as part of that, or it leads to it. So again, the cyclical process. So I'm going to stop there because I've probably rambled on for too long already.
Christine, brilliant as always. Thank you so much for that. I learned so much. And that's after having spent 4 years with you already. So thank you for that. I think what you did with that talk was really personalize it. I was not expecting that, to be honest, folks. I was expecting a lot more of a professional talk, but here the connection between why what you do, your personal reasons for getting engaged in research and staying at it becomes so important, right? And I want to quickly reflect on 2 of the lessons that you've shared and how you really actually passed them on to me in such a real way. Lesson 4, which is, starting the core and sustaining it by empowering others. And I'm thinking back, yeah, I was part of your core in Australia. And then I realized literally like a month after I handed in my thesis, I started the Wonder Labs Design Challenge. And I'm thinking about how, yeah, that really was about paying it forward, and creating this ripple effect. And we're through 2 cohorts now, 7 teams. And I know for a fact that that ripple effect has occurred, and so on and so forth, because each of you now from the existing and the previous Design Challenge teams are going to go out and further on create those ripples. And I know that we've trained social science researchers in thinking about wildfires across California and Colorado and Oregon and nationwide. And those folks now are going into fire and forestry jobs, looking for ways to, work towards just outcomes for marginalized, underserved populations. And I think that has really been the thrust of lesson 4. And you can see it rippling out in real time. And I feel like lesson 5, my gosh, yes, keep at it. Everything bears repeating. I find myself constantly repeating things. And I'm like, didn't you hear that? No, you didn't. And so I'm going to do the job, the hard work of repeating it, because that's our job. Keep at it, right? And that kind of longitudinal engagement where you're constantly threading together is key. And I'm finding that not so much with community partners, but actually more on the policy front. Absolutely. I think our job is to educate constantly why this research is important, why the findings have to be understood and distilled and implemented. And we have to get really good at that kind of communication to be able to let it materialize, let it socialize. And yes. And lesson 7, oh my God, always have an agenda. Always have an agenda. With your research. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you again, Christine. And I'm going to open it up for everyone else's reflections. Who wants to go first? You can raise your hand. Kyle, go for it.
Hi, Dr. Eriksen. It's great to be at this talk with you. And thank you so much for sharing all of that knowledge. I was wondering, you talked a bit about the role of the researcher in providing insight to support decision-making, and also how it can take a long time to see those findings in action, and a little bit about the off-the-record conversations that took place to kind of get some of those actions going, at least in the Switzerland example. But I was wondering if you can go a little bit more in depth about effective methods and catalysts for basically turning findings that call for needs for transformation into concrete actions with systems of power?
That's a great question. Thank you, Carl. It's, of course, context dependent. So it varies from one project to the next. One of the ways I try to start my projects is I try to have buy-in from the get-go. So I don't try to sell the message once the results have materialized, because by then, yes, they might be super interesting, but it might not be what people were interested in the first place. And so having the conversation from the beginning means that not only do you get buy-in, but you might also change something that you are doing because of that feedback. That makes it much more actionable in the end, which can be something significant and big, but it can be something really small that you hadn't realized, that if you asked about it from the left side rather than the right side, you would suddenly get buy-in. And so that's one way I would say, is that to try and get not just feedback, but kind of buy-in at a very early stage of any project, even though, of course, it can be hard, because they will ask you, well, what are you going to deliver? And that's part of the point, right, is that you don't necessarily know, because if we knew all the answers, we wouldn't be doing it in the first place. So it's about finding a language that you're comfortable with, where you don't promise something that you can't necessarily deliver, but where you can take them on the journey with you. So a lot of the long-term kind of 10 plus years relationships I have with stakeholders is because I've taken them on the journey with me. And so they have learned together with me, and I've learned from them and they've learned from me, but we've also learned together from the people who have participated in the research. And so that it would be another thing, I think, is finding something. It comes to the point about making it accessible as well, right? Is that we won't necessarily come up with the solutions, but we might come up with something that will help them find a solution. And so maybe that's the point at the end of the project, is that if you can keep unpacking for them why it is you're recommending what you're recommending, to keep helping them implement it, to make something actionable, because it might not be immediately apparent for them how that can be applied, and that might take many conversations again. And so that again is about that kind of sustained conversation and the sustained way that you are learning continuously, even though you feel like you might have all the answers. But once you have the answers about something, you need answers to how to make it something that can be applied by others.
I think in the case of the design challenge, we've really centered co-creation right from the get-go, right? Even the way that it's designed, teams are paired up in such a way that I expect an application to come in from students who have their faculty advisors or research advisors on board, along with a community partner, at least one community partner, right? And so that's in the very design of the challenge, is that your challenge is to design a process by which you can bring together all of these ideas, all of these expectations of this research, and come up with something that answers to the reality of that particular community. Or in the case of the FireGen Collaborative, I know we define communities more broadly, and that's, again, that's been an expanding factor in our definition of communities, right, at the design challenge. But from the get-go, it is about co-learning, it is about co-producing for the benefit of everyone involved. And I think also another reflection, I don't know, I don't see any other hands raised, so I'm going to say one more thing. I feel like over the years, there's also been a real shift from this whole ethic of giving back from social science research. So, you know, this kind of, we helicopter in, we do the research, and then we leave. And there's been a lot of great reflections, and I'll put some resources in the chat from within social sciences, including wildfires, research, which is around the fact that, like I said earlier, a lot of our student researchers and early career researchers are from communities that are on the front lines, that are being affected. And so it is, as Christine rightly says, it has become personal. It's not something out there. It's not theoretical. It's not something that you're interested in. You feel for it because it hurts you. It hurts your neighbors, these kinds of climate impacts, the wildfire impacts. And so it's no longer giving back in some way. That reciprocity has changed to a process of let's do this together. And hence the co-learning and the co-creation and the co-production of findings and recommendations that suit that particular community. And so that is really very much part of how we approach things at the Design Challenge. I am gonna look for hands. I don't see any. Does anyone have anything more to share or questions to ask? Meanwhile, I'm gonna put in some really great resources that I have used over the past years. And these are really in addition to everything Christine writes about.
I'll just step off to thank you, Christine, for kind of framing this research. And I appreciated actually the personal reflections. This is not my typical space as a community based organization in terms of the research connection side, but I have been working with all of our students closely. So I'll be sharing kind of what you had shared today to kind of keep them going. I think that's the piece that we're at for our effort. And again, it's nice to meet everybody here. And Shefali, thanks again for the reminder of those concrete examples from last year as we're finalizing what the products are that we want to develop as well. So, but nice to meet all of you as well. Thank you for this morning.
Kari, if I still have you online for another 5 minutes, I'd
Yep.
I'd love for you to talk a bit as a community partner who's matched up with student researchers and university-based teams. What is it that you look for? And is this model something that you've been engaged in the past with FRP, or is this something that you've been introduced to now and you like it and you're going to go forward with it, hopefully? If you just talk a bit.
Sure. So my background, so I'm a little bit unusual in FFRP. So for those of you who don't know us as well, we are an organization that started in Southern California, supporting people to go into forestry and fire careers. And most of our staff team really came out of the fire camps and have a goal of opening up these pathways for more folks. My background is in education, and I did have some background in service learning and community-based research. But that was a couple decades ago, I will acknowledge. So I understand the potential of it. And I would say that this process of working with our local underground scholars at UC Berkeley and also from the University of Michigan, has continued to show us what the potential is when we can partner with folks who can help us really think about the bigger picture of what's going on around us, help to frame it in light of other research that's going on, help us to look at statistics and pull out stories and interviews, kind of those reflective moments that just on the day-to-day basis of being a community-based organization, we really don't have the time to do. And so in terms of that pause and that reflection that was spoken about earlier today, I think we've really seen the value of that for us in an organization. So my position has switched from being just the Bay Area director to get our programs going from Southern California to the Bay, to being more of a director of innovation and strategy for the organization, and recognizing the importance of really contextualizing our work, and also always thinking about, are we doing this in the best way possible? And so we are also exploring ways to build on this work with the University of Michigan and kind of their SEAS program, and continuing to look at ways to engage students, because we really don't have that in-house capacity. And I've appreciated the partnership with the students. And what I look for in those research partners are people who have a sincere interest in helping us as an organization to improve, who appreciate the access that they have to resources at their universities and out in the community that we might not as readily have access to, and helping to break that down for us in pretty basic terms so that we're all recognizing that we have different strengths to bring to the table. So we as an organization have the day-to-day experience, the access to the people who are directly in this work, but we just don't have that time to kind of like pull it together. Whereas our research partners, both the professors and the students that we're working with, really that's their regular mode of operation. And to access that and bring that to the table for us has been a really fruitful opportunity. And we know that we can't work in a vacuum. So while we're trying to do the direct service of our work here, we also see this as contributing to both sustaining our work, helping us to tell our story better, and then also being able to contribute to the bigger policy picture as we advocate to continue opening up these pathways for more people of color and more people who are justice impacted to be able to pursue these careers. But we need help in telling that story. So we're appreciative of that partnership as a result. Hopefully that gives a sense of things. Thanks, Shefali.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kari. Yeah, it's about, again, like I said, threading research findings into community applications, and then hopefully, like our team at the FireGen Collaborative certainly is managing to do, feeding it up into policy and where the funding goes, right? That's a huge piece of it. And Christine, you talked to that as well. How do you influence policy? It may take a while, it always does, but we have to keep at it. And Ryan and Kyle, do you want to share any experiences from your journey at the FireGen Collaborative?
I'll jump in, Ryan. I'm not sure if you're probably here, but just wanted to pass it off to you, and you can add anything that I missed. But I guess I'll start off just saying that FireGen is a group, for context, of different young people around the country who come from different marginalized backgrounds in fire, whether that's from a point of sexuality, of gender, of ethnicity, of indigeneity. And we really want to create a space for like young people to together like imagine what our futures look like in the fire space, especially considering that we're not only both so impacted as a generation, but also depended on by a lot of the solutions that we typically don't have a role in co-creating, right? Like a lot of these strategies over the coming decades are being created, expected for our generation to carry them out without us having a seat at the table of how that of how those strategies are created. And so FireGen is both, we have a variety of pillars. They include intergenerational decision-making to help remedy those different issues, but also Indigenous ecosystem management, and then also educational pathways, both inside and into the fire workforce, to make it more just and accessible to people of marginalized backgrounds. And so I guess like we've learned a lot. The Wildland Fire Mitigation Management Report just came out this past week in the US. And we had an opportunity earlier this year, which was launched in many ways thanks to us being part of the Living with Fire Design Challenge. But earlier in the year, we had an opportunity to organize a national youth panel that brought youth perspectives for the first time to that commission. And then some of our recommendations following that panel actually made it up into the final report, as well as a lot of sort of reflection. You could see like in the report dedicated a half page just to like the other recommendations, which were a little bit more systemic that we were asking for, but we're glad that they included like a reflection on engaging with young people and what our other asked for, even if it couldn't be forwarded. So that was an interesting process, but we're kind of pairing these like this work to create spaces of power for young people with like research to better understand our generation from a point of not just like how do we fit into the existing systems, but really what are young people, particularly ones excluded from the mainstream of this field, what are we wanting out of this like so-called mass mobilization into fire resilience? What are we looking for as young people, as a generation, as different people of various excluded identities? So I'll pass that over to Ryan, but that's like some of the main goals, kind of pairing like policy and like action and organizing in those fronts with like research to try to build more understanding of ourselves that is created by like people who kind of like bridging the practitioner and the researcher idea. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I don't have much to add. Kyle did a really good job of kind of encapturing our pathways to this. I do want to shine light on Meredith and Gary, who are a part of our FireGen research team and doing a lot of work in that front. And I think it's just we're in a position of unique background and approaches. Oh, Carissa, sorry, I didn't see that. I don't think we've met Carissa actually. But I want to just say that a lot of our approaches to fire is very unique, and I think that is almost not representative, but it gives a good idea and understanding of how other folks who are fire practitioners are not fire practitioners who are equally impacted and also have a lot of influence on proactive management, right? So, shutting down a prescribed fire, if you will, those public perception and, external facing conversations and dialogue are critical and they have a huge importance. And so kind of the education of folks and understanding where the next generation is critical for how we're able to manage our landscapes. And so I think that one of the great things that we're trying to do within our research is something that you've mentioned, Christine, is just the decolonial framework that needs to be implemented. And I think it's not, I've grown up with research that has been conducted and parachute article research, however you want to call it, but I've understood it as being parachute is where folks come in, grab what they want, and then they head out. And that's a very anthropological concept that is derived from colonial past, and it's been done since white man came to my area, and it's continued to be happening. So what ways can we do something different? And I think that our group of researchers, who are part of our conversations have that ideology framework at our forefront of the research, and that's why I'm really excited about it. As I mentioned, like I just grew up with research, and so research has been really a turnoff just as an Indigenous person. And so having somebody come into communities and perpetuating the same harm, that even though it could be coming from a good place, doesn't mean that harm is not going to be produced, right? So yeah, and so I guess I just want to emphasize on a really good note that our researches and our framework, and whether it's our backgrounds, I think it really is coming to talks like yours, Christine, and being opportunities to where we can kind of understand exactly what needs to be done within the frameworks and kind of how we're able to build these relationships moving forward. Because I think it's really easy to write an intro, methods, discussion, whatever you want to call it, in a very Western science-based thing. But for us in the communities who have to endure these impacts, can really give a care about any of the other elements that you need to do. But there's that balance. And so yeah, I just want to say I'm really excited to be here, as well as and see how our research conducted and where it navigates. But with that, I want to pass it to other folks from FireGen who've been really diving and immersing themselves within the research and process or questions they might have as they navigate it. So Meredith, Garrett, and Carissa, more than welcome to kind of jump in here.
I just want to acknowledge that it is over 9:30 here, but if Christina is willing to stay another 5 minutes, I'd be very happy to hear from the other folks at FireGen.
Thanks everyone for your thoughts, and thank you, Dr. Eriksen, for sharing with us. I don't think I have too much to add. Kyle and Ryan, it covered a lot of why I'm excited about our research project, and really resonate with the kind of just like fear or desire to like make sure that our research really does have positive impact on policy, and like that wouldn't want to waste people's time with research that then doesn't get listened to by policymakers. And so how to navigate that and be in it for the long game is something that's definitely on my mind, and I think all of our minds. So thank you for sharing.
I might quickly just jump in there and say, it's not always that the research is immediately apparent what the benefits are to others apart from the researcher. But this is something we can't necessarily always control. And I think that's one of the things that makes us very vulnerable to kind of our mental health, is that we have to keep going, even though it's not always obvious. But that's where the temporal element come into it, is that sometimes it takes time before others are ready to listen and hear. And I think this is really inspiring to hear about this project and how you're really kind of stepping up and saying, well, this is our voice and this is what we think and this is the impact on us. And that's so important, right? Because if it's always the same people whose voice is heard, then nothing's ever going to change.
Yep. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you so much, Christine. That was so great, and a great way to start this week and to think about all the work that we're doing, and all the passion that our teams bring to their work. And I want to remind the teams that we are inviting for the Fire Journal special issue your submissions, so bring them in. The deadline is 15 December. I did put it in the chat, the link, and I can send it around once again through email. But we really look forward to reading about your methods and your process. I think you have so much to add to the discussion, right? Well, thank you. Thank you all so much. Take care, everyone, and speak soon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.